So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about the murder of Lesley Herring. This was quite a publicised case at the time that it happened, but I don't see much media about it now that it's already happened, if that makes sense. It was quite big, it was on every news channel as it was progressing, but ever since the case was closed, I don't hear people talking about it, so I wanted to make a full video on it today for you. But before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service with over 3,000 titles on a range of different subjects from Earth to space, science, history, and of course, true crime. They have documentaries on cases that I bet you've never even heard of before, like small cases from different countries all over the world, cases that I think a lot of us wouldn't know without Magellan TV, which makes it perfect for true crime junkies like me and you because we've rinsed absolutely every other documentary on every other case. They do have some of the big ones on there, like Charles Manson. I believe there was one on Dennis Nielsen, but if you're looking for those cases that no one else has really covered before, Magellan TV is for you. My latest watch on there was The Last Confessions of the Cannibal, which was actually more of a biographical film than a documentary. It was a little bit more dramatized, but it was still very true to the story. And it was based on the Irish murderer and cannibal Alexander Pierce, who was actually executed for his crimes in the 1800s. Him and a group of other convicts actually escaped prison, and while they were all on the run, they actually took it in turn to vote for one of the group to be killed and eaten so that the rest of the group could survive on the run. And they were just like killing each other off one by one. It's the most insane story I've ever heard. I might have to cover it at some point on this channel. I'm not going to tell you any more about the case though, because I don't want to ruin it for you. Make sure you go into Magellan TV to watch The Last Confessions of the Cannibal. It's crazy. Magellan TV update their selections every single week, so there's always something new for you to watch. It's completely ad-free and you can watch it on pretty much any device you have, so what are you waiting for? And they're very kindly offering you guys a limited time offer of 30% off of an annual subscription, making it just $3.50 a month, plus a 2-week free trial to start that off. $3.50 a month and 2 weeks free. That is crazy. All you need to do is go to the link down below in the description to go and claim that offer while you still can. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a quick content warning before we get into this one. This case does involve domestic abuse, so if that is something that you don't want to hear about right now, feel free to click out of the video and look after yourself. I'm sure I'll see you again some other time with a case that's a little bit more suited for you. But anyway, let's just get into it. Lesley Herring was a 44-year-old woman originally from Guyana in South America. While she was still very young, Lesley and her whole family upped and moved to Los Angeles, California, and she was one of a few siblings. She had a brother named Lyndon and a sister named Aasha, although I'm not sure if there were any more siblings, so I'm sorry if I'm forgetting anyone. Those two were the only names I came across in my research anyway. And they said that Lesley, ever since she was a child, she was always the most sensible, the most responsible, the most grown up one of the group. Even when they were little kids, she was always the good one. And this translated into her teenage years. When she was at school, she was always very organized, very hardworking. She applied herself, and then that followed on into her adult life. She was a very career-centered woman. She had big mum friend energy, if that makes sense. She was the one that looked after everyone else, made sure everyone else was okay. She was very kind, caring, no nonsense. She didn't put up with any kind of BS. But don't get me wrong, she was very happy, very bubbly, very, you know, positive and just happy to be there. But if you got on the wrong side of her, she would literally just ice you out. She wasn't a fighter, but she was also not going to pay you any mind after that. From my research, Lesley Herring just seems like such a badass woman. In her teenage years, Lesley and her sister Aasha were very close to their mum. They were like a little three. And her sister Aasha, by the way, just a side note, you might recognize the name Aasha Davis, which is Lesley's sister, because she actually grew up to become a very successful actress in Hollywood. She's been in Grey's Anatomy, Gilmore Girls, Friday Night Lights, House, ER. She's been in a lot. Super successful, super talented, and Lesley was always so proud of her sister. But personally, for Lesley, a life out of the spotlight was a lot more her style. She opted for a much more private life and a private career. She had a desk job working for a home security company. I think she was pretty high up in this company. And like I say, she was a very career-driven woman. She was proud of what she did, and she did it well. And because she was a hard-working, career-driven woman, that meant that when it came to her romantic life, she needed that same quality in a man, and she found exactly that. In the early 2000s, Lesley met Lyle Herring, and he was just as career-driven and focused and sensible and good with money as Lesley was. At the time of this case in 2009, he was 56 years old, but they met almost a decade before that, so he was probably in his late 40s when they met. And when Lesley met him, she was actually only in like her mid-20s, late 20s, but because of her mindset, she'd always been a lot more mature. She'd always liked much more mature men, so then when she met Lyle Herring, he was just kind of perfect for her. Lyle Herring was a charmer. He was a very social man. Everyone who ever met Lyle liked him. He gave off a good first impression to absolutely everyone. And Lesley absolutely loved all of that about him. And the two of them very quickly decided that this was it for them. They couldn't see themselves with anyone else. They wanted to be together for the rest of their lives. And so rather quickly, the two of them married. I think they actually just went to the local marriage office and just eloped there. I don't think they had a big wedding. I might be wrong, but it seemed like it was quite a quick thing to happen. But now they were excited for the rest of their lives together, and they decided that the next step would be to move in together. So they bought quite an expensive condo in Los Angeles. They actually also bought a sailboat together, and they would go out on the weekends, they would go out in the harbour, like they loved this boat. Lesley and Lyle just seemed to be the most perfect, successful, high-earning, respected couple. They were like a power couple. They really were. And they were so in love with each other as well. Like, their families could just see it in them. I mean, they would wear matching jumpers and matching hats. And they'd take these little matching hats on vacation with them, and they'd wear them walking around holding hands. I don't know why I love that fact so much, but matching hats and matching jumpers is so cute. They were together almost all day, every day that they weren't both at work. They never got tired of each other's company. They were just a really nice seeming couple. But all of that came crashing down on February 9th, 2009, when Lesley's sister Aasha got a call from Lesley's boss at work. Her boss said that Lesley hadn't arrived at work that morning, and she couldn't actually get hold of her. She tried to ring her mobile, she tried to ring her home phone, and she wasn't answering. And so the boss just wanted to contact her sister to make sure that Lesley was okay, because this was very unlike her. Like I've been saying through this whole video, Lesley was all about her career. She was very driven, very focused, very hardworking. She was literally the type of woman to go to work in the middle of a hurricane. It didn't matter how sick she was or what was going on in her life, she was not going to miss a day of work. And if she did, she would always call her boss and explain and give a reason and let them know that she wouldn't be there. She would never just ghost. And Aasha felt the same. When the boss was saying this on the phone to her, Aasha was thinking, yeah, this is not like my sister at all. And so as soon as she got off the phone with Lesley's boss, she actually tried to call Lesley's phone herself. And again, Lesley didn't pick up. And so Aasha then decided to call their brother, Lyndon, and just kind of give him a rundown of the situation, ask if he'd heard from Lesley, but again, he hadn't. And this had made him realise that he actually hadn't heard from her in a few days. It's one of those things you don't really notice if you're busy that you haven't heard from a particular person in a while, but now that he was hearing that Lesley hadn't turned up at work, he was getting panicked. So they tried to call Lyle, Lesley's husband, and he also wasn't picking up. Neither of them were. So now the family is even more concerned because it seems that something could have happened to both of them, Lesley and Lyle. And Lyle was just the same as Lesley was. He wasn't the type to just not answer his phone or not contact anyone. So the family knew pretty much immediately that something bad had happened. Lyndon said that he had all of these really concerning thoughts circling around his head, like, have they been kidnapped? Have they both gone out on the boat and hit a tide? And have they capsized and drowned? So Aasha and Lyndon decided to go down to Lesley and Lyle's home to make sure that everything was okay. But when they got there, I mean, nothing seemed amiss from the outside. They did live in an apartment building, so it was unlikely that they would have been broken into. Like, no one could smash through a window and climb in. And the front door seemed fine. It was locked. So they knocked on the door. No one came to answer, and they were just standing out there for a few hours. They kept knocking on the door, they kept calling them, but before long they just had this overwhelming feeling that something bad had happened, and so they decided to just go ahead and call the police. So police came down to the address and they were asked to perform a welfare check. So if you don't know what one of those is, it's where if you're worried about someone, you can call a welfare check on them. Police will go to the house and they are not allowed to leave that house until they've seen and spoken to the person that you're worried about and made sure that they're okay. Police came down and they kicked in the front door. They got in there to try and find Lesley and Lyle. They started walking through the first couple of rooms, but as they did, everything just seemed very normal. I mean, it was the usual neat, tidy, clean house that Lesley always ran. But as they continued walking through the house, there were a few little things that just seemed off. For example, there was a candle in the kitchen that had been knocked over and all of the melted wax had like fallen all over the counter, dripped onto the floor, and it had hardened and not been cleaned up, which was unlike Lesley. If Lesley had accidentally knocked over a candle, that thing would have been cleaned up immediately. I mean, a knocked over candle doesn't scream danger by any means, but everyone was a little bit like, that's not very like her. There were also a bunch of towels in the bathroom that were all like screwed up and bunched up on the floor. A few of them seemed to have been like hung over different things, like the shower wall and a railing to be dried out. They found that most of these towels were dry, but in this big bunch of them on the floor, like the bottom ones were still wet. So it looked as though they'd been trying to soak up a mass of water maybe. But it had been a while because the top ones were dry. It was the bottom ones that were still damp. I don't know, it just really didn't seem like Lesley Herring's house. This wouldn't be how she lived. But aside from these few little weird things, it didn't seem like there'd been a break-in or anything crazy had happened in here. And so all her family could really do was file a missing persons report for Lesley. So police did some digging and they found that the last time that Lesley Herring was seen and heard from was on the evening of February 6th, which was almost 72 hours prior to this moment. It had been almost 3 days since anyone had seen or heard from Lesley. And that was actually by her work colleagues who had seen her on the Friday evening as she was leaving work for the weekend. So through this whole weekend, no one had seen her. But they were able to find that she was okay, at least, until the Sunday morning. So 24 hours before she was discovered missing. Because on that Sunday morning, she actually had a phone call with someone. So someone did hear from her, but they just didn't see her in person. So we don't 100% know what her situation was like on that Sunday morning. But she was alive and kind of in her life, if that makes sense. She was communicating with people that she knew. So Lesley's family, over the next few days, they campaigned to get her face and her missing poster everywhere that they possibly could. On lampposts outside, on the news, on talk shows. Her sister was doing public appeals left, right and centre because she was a familiar face. She was kind of using that to her advantage because people were listening. You know, if this famous person goes on TV and says, my sister is missing, I need everyone's help, people were tuning in. Everyone knew about Lesley Herring. They did everything they could for days on end, but still there was absolutely no communication from Lyle or Lesley. They didn't return home, they didn't text anyone, they didn't return anyone's calls. So police decided to put out alerts for both of their cars, hoping that if they were just on the run somewhere, maybe they'd just run away to start a new life together, then at least they would be able to find them and make sure that they're okay. But 2 weeks went by in this case with nothing. They got no leads on the car, they got no leads in general. The main theory at this point, of course, was that Lesley and Lyle were both together. Wherever they were, whatever had happened to them, it had happened to both of them at the same time. And Lesley's family said that they knew at this point. They just knew, they just had a feeling that something really bad had happened to Lesley. They didn't really think that they were gonna get her back alive. I have a quote here from her sister Aasha that says, "I think something terrible must have happened to her. Just because I know that my sister would be in contact with us. She would want us to know where she was. She would know that we would worry about her so much." Another thing that made her family believe this was that Lesley was happy with her life. So there was very little chance of her just like wanting to run away from everything and start a new life somewhere. She had a great job, a great family, a great life, a great house. She had a great career. Like, everything was going so well for Lesley, and she was happy. Like, her family really genuinely thought that she was happy. Her sister Aasha had literally just had a baby 4 weeks before Lesley went missing, and she was really excited to be an auntie and to meet this baby. So they really didn't think that she left off her own accord. They thought that whatever happened to her must have been bad, because she would never do this. And then 2 weeks into the investigation, police finally got their first breakthrough in this case when Lyle Herring's car was found. The alert that police had put out had worked, and police had found Lyle Herring's car trying to cross over into the Mexican border, and Lyle was in the car. He was alive and he was fine. But there was no Lesley. So immediately, police were very, very suspicious of this situation. So they bring him straight into the police station for an interview, and they're asking him all about Lesley, all about where he'd been for the last 2 weeks. He said that the last time he'd seen his wife, Lesley, was on the Saturday night. So that was the 7th of February. He said that the two of them had had an argument that night, and they went to bed, and when he woke up the next morning on the Sunday morning, Lesley wasn't there. She wasn't in the house, she wasn't laying next to him, and so he thought that he would just like leave her to it. Maybe she needed some space, maybe she needed some time. Remember, she was heard from on that Sunday morning. A friend had a phone call with her on the Sunday morning, so she was alive and she was well. Lyle told police that he had tried to contact Lesley a couple of times over the past couple of weeks. He tried calling her and texting her, but she hadn't returned any of those calls or texts, and he himself had actually just tried to get away from it all for a little while. He'd been driving around in his car, going to different places. He said that he was unable to get hold of her, and he also had no idea where she was at this point. And he said that the only reason that he was heading into Mexico, because remember, police actually caught him trying to go into Mexico at the Mexican border. He said that the reason he was going there was actually to look for Lesley. He said that the two of them actually had this romantic getaway booked in Mexico for Valentine's Day, because she only went missing a few days before Valentine's Day. It had been booked for ages, the two of them were really excited for it, and of course she went missing, and so he thought, well, maybe she might be there if I go there. Maybe she had just tried to get away from her life for a few days, and maybe she would meet him in Mexico, because she knew that those plans were happening. So he thought if he went there, she might be there. So at this point in Lyle's interview, he hadn't really said much. Like, I've told you everything that he said, and police were still trying to ask him questions. They were like, is it normal for Lesley to just like go off her phone? Is it normal for her to not return texts or calls? And it was at this point that Lyle Herring just shut down. He said, I don't want to answer any more questions. I've got nothing else to say. I don't know where she is. I don't want to do this anymore. And so with that, the police interview ended. But this left a bad taste in people's mouths about Lyle Herring. I'm sure you can see why. I mean, his beloved wife has just gone missing. She's been missing for almost 3 weeks now, and he is actively trying to not help. Does that make sense? If that was your soulmate, the love of your life, would you not sit there in that police office and give absolutely every tiny piece of detail or information that you possibly could if it meant the chances of finding them were larger? Even Lesley's sister Aasha mentioned in one of her TV appeals that she found this really odd from him as well. He was being very uncooperative and very inconsistent with his communication with not only the police, but also the rest of Lesley's family as well, which was weird. I can somewhat understand the hesitant communication with the police, you know, maybe due to anxiety, and we know how the police are, especially with people of colour in America. I can understand that. But with the family, of your wife that is now missing. He stopped returning their phone calls, their texts. And this is Lesley's own brother, Lesley's own sister, who were equally as worried about her as he should have been. Surely they should all be supporting each other right now. This is a time to come together and to be each other's shoulder to cry on, each other's inspiring words. They shouldn't be ignoring each other. Police said to Lesley's family that Lyle wasn't a suspect at this point. They could appreciate that he was uncooperative and acting a little bit weird, but they didn't actually think he'd done anything to Lesley. But they did think that maybe he knew a little bit more than he was letting on about this situation. Maybe he knew where she was and he was just covering. So anyway, a couple of days go by and police actually managed to get Lyle in for a second interview. And this time they decided to bring something up that they'd actually noticed about Lyle the first time, but they hadn't got around to asking him about it, obviously, because he shut down and said, no more questions, I don't want to say anything else. So they decided to bring up this thing, which was that Lyle, since he'd gone missing for 2 weeks and then reappeared, he looked completely different to what he used to look like. He used to have super long dreadlocks, a goatee like beard thing, and since he'd come back, he was fully shaven. His head was bald, he had no facial hair left. So naturally, police were a little bit suspicious about this. Why did he have such a change of heart about his whole appearance? And his dreadlocks were long as well. They must have taken a long time to grow and care for. Same kind of thing with the facial hair as well. It takes a long time to grow and shape, and he just suddenly decided to get rid of it all. So police asked him about this, and they asked why he'd decided to shave it, and he said he didn't actually do it himself. It was involuntarily done. He said that he had been attacked by a gang of men, pinned down, and had his hair and beard shaven as punishment. He said that he owed a lot of money to this particular shady group of men. I don't know the backstory to that whatsoever. I don't even know if it's true, let's be honest. But he said that he owed them a lot of money and he couldn't pay it, and so they tracked him down, pinned him down and shaved him to teach him a lesson. And the police officers that were listening to this story, they didn't believe it for 1 second. I mean, what do you mean? You owe shady people money, and to be able to get that money back, they pin you down and shave all your hair off? What? This is a shady, dodgy group of people. Would they not have slightly more violent techniques to get the money out of you that you owe them? Not that I condone violence in any way, but gangs like this, they would beat you up, or they would, they would do something a little bit more scary and violent to get the money. They wouldn't give you a haircut. It was mounting suspicion against Lyle, but at the same time, it still wasn't evidence, and so police just had to let him go from this interview again. But before they actually let him out of the police station, they decided that they wanted to have one last search of their apartment. Because if there were any pieces of evidence in that house that related to Lesley or her disappearance or her potential death, police needed to find those pieces of evidence before Lyle went back in there and was able to get rid of them. And it was in this search of her house that police found that all of Lesley's jewellery, her bracelets, earrings, necklaces, were all still on her nightstand. Now this might not sound too crazy, but Lesley's family said that she was the kind of woman that would never leave her house without jewellery on. She was a very classy lady. She was very proper and well presented at all times. She would never leave her house without jewellery, so this already seemed very, very unnatural. They also found Lesley's handbag with her purse still in it, which had all of her money, all her credit cards, debit cards, her ID, everything was still there. If she had run away and tried to start a new life, she wouldn't have any money. She wouldn't be able to do it. She didn't have any of her belongings. So this completely eradicated the theory that Lesley could have possibly have gone off her own accord. Something definitely happened to Lesley Herring. During the search, police actually also found a note written by Lesley in her nightstand. I think it was maybe pushed under her nightstand. And they found that this was actually a letter that Lesley herself had written to Lyle. And this letter revealed a lot of things that police and also Lesley's family hadn't known prior to this moment. She explained in this letter that she was very angry with how Lyle had been spending his money at this point in time, because he actually didn't have a secure job at this moment. I don't know what had gone on with his job, but I think he'd quit or he'd been fired and he was between jobs, but he wasn't finding another job quick enough. So they were kind of living off savings and Lesley's single paycheck. And it wasn't enough. Money was about to start running out and Lyle wasn't getting a job. He wasn't lowering his spending to accommodate their new income. Lesley told Lyle that he shouldn't have spent $1,200 on this Valentine's getaway that they were going on, which is quite expensive if you don't have a job. Quite expensive at the best of times, but especially if you don't have a job. She explains in this letter that she wakes up almost every day wondering if they will be okay. Like wondering if they will have enough money just to get by. This note made it very clear to the police that the couple were having financial issues at the time of Lesley's disappearance, and they were very much disagreeing on how to handle these financial issues. Lesley said in this letter, no one should have to live this way. Live day to day, not knowing if they are going to have a roof over their head. There were points in this letter where Lesley referred to Lyle as her husband, like with quotation marks around it, which also suggests conflict in their marriage if she's calling him her husband. She also said in this note that she deserved better than him. Actually, an exact quote was, I deserve better. What's the point of talking to you? So you can lie, lie, lie. And she ended this letter with a final sentence, I can't take any more. I'm broken. So this letter was huge evidence for this investigation. But believe it or not, police found something even bigger in the apartment, some even bigger evidence. Inside Lesley's purse, police found a Starbucks receipt from 4 days after her disappearance. When everyone thought she was missing, 4 days into the investigation, it looked as though she'd been to Starbucks and bought a coffee and then just left her bag at her house. So now it was looking like maybe Lesley was okay. Maybe she had literally just left just to start a new life. Police noted down the time and the specific Starbucks where this receipt was from, and they went down there and asked if they could have a look at their CCTV footage. They hoped that the CCTV footage could tell them a lot more about the situation. Maybe they were going to see Lesley on this footage walking into Starbucks, buying a coffee. Maybe she would look fine. Maybe she would look like she was okay. But when detectives got this footage back to the police station and they looked through it, the person on that footage wasn't Lesley Herring. It was Lyle. Lyle walks into the Starbucks, buys a drink, and then leaves. And somehow that receipt from his purchase somehow ended up in Lesley's purse. How? And also, why? Well, police immediately thought that Lyle had planted this receipt, placed it in Lesley's purse to make police think that she was okay and that she was out and about and she was still doing things. Maybe it was a cover-up for something. By the way, as this search of the apartment was going on, as they'd been looking through all this evidence and stuff, Lyle wasn't allowed to go back home. Instead, he went on TV and he was doing TV appeals. He was like crying on the news. He was begging for any witnesses to come forward, and this just seemed like a completely different Lyle to the one that was in the first half of the investigation. This is a completely different Lyle to the one that had been ignoring Lesley's family's calls and texts. He wouldn't communicate with the police. He shut down the interview that he was having. This was a completely different man that was now crying on the news. But in the background, something that he didn't know was that the suspicion against him was mounting rapidly, literally by the hour. And it was only going to get worse for him, because at this point in the case, police decided to seize all of his electronics, his laptop, his phone, computer, everything. They looked into his call history on his phone and seen that on the day of Lesley's disappearance, on the Monday, he'd actually called her phone multiple times throughout the day and she'd picked up every single one. So now police thought, well, perfect. If Lesley was picking up the phone, then they would be able to track down this phone call and maybe find Lesley's location. Maybe she is out there somewhere, she's just not picking up the phone. So they followed the location of both of the sides of the call, so Lyle making the call and Lesley receiving the call, and they found that these two locations were actually the same location. Both phones were right next to each other when these calls were made. Why would Lyle need to call Lesley if she was right next to him? Unless these calls were done as another cover-up. It was another decoy, just like the receipt. He was trying to throw police off of the investigation. So at this point in the investigation, police were very suspicious of Lyle Herring, of course, and so they decided to call in all of his close friends, family, everyone that knew him really well, because they wanted to know what kind of guy this was. Like, truly what kind of guy this was. Because in the beginning, they thought he was quite a good guy, because that's what Lesley's family thought. But now, it seemed like he had a different side to him that they were never aware of. Like I said, Lesley's family all seemed to really like Lyle. He was a very social person, he was very charming, very charismatic. At least he was with the women. But through these interviews with people that knew Lyle, they were finding out that the men, Lyle didn't quite have the same effect on men. They'd always had some kind of funny feeling about Lyle. All the men in the family. Like, he was kind of up to something. The women couldn't see it, and whenever one of the men would bring it up to one of the women, like, what's going on with Lyle? What do you think to him? He's a bit weird. The women would be like, oh no, he's really nice. He's really charming. Maybe that was just because Lyle was better at manipulating women than he was men, and maybe these men could see through his intentions. They didn't really know what this weird energy was. They couldn't quite put their finger on what it was about this man. There was just always something about him that just seemed weird and off. And in these interviews, police spoke with Lyle's cousin Malcolm, who actually saw Lyle a couple of days after Lesley went missing. Of course, at this point, no one actually knew Lesley was missing. She hadn't been reported missing. She hadn't not turned up at work yet. But we know based on different pieces of evidence that she was already missing at this point. And when Malcolm met with Lyle, he recalled him being very weird. He was just acting really weird. So anyway, Malcolm said that he met with Lyle outside the apartment building. Lyle wouldn't let him inside the apartment for some reason, so they met up like in the car park outside, and Lyle was acting really tetchy and off. He was really on edge. He was like pacing around. He seemed quite anxious. And he was saying really weird things that seemed really out of context, but now looking back seem really suspicious. He was saying things like, man, I'm gonna burn in hell for what I did, and stuff like that. Crazy stuff like that. And at the time, Malcolm had no idea what the hell his cousin was talking about. How would you? He had no context clues. He had no idea what had happened with Lesley. He didn't really understand. He just knew that his cousin was going through something, and so he was trying to be like supportive and there for him and like, you know, talk to me, but Lyle wouldn't talk to him. But as Malcolm started thinking about it more and more, he started thinking up some possibilities in his head, and the one that he kept coming back to over and over again was that maybe something had happened to Lesley. Maybe they'd gotten in a fight or an argument, and maybe Lyle had abused her or hit her or, you know, something. And so Malcolm really wanted to get inside that apartment to go and check on Lesley. He wanted to make sure that she was okay, that this wasn't the thing that Lyle was talking about burning in hell for. So the way he went about this was he asked Lyle if he could go and use his bathroom, and Lyle actually said no. And immediately Malcolm thought this was odd. This basically reinforced his theory in his head that something had happened to Lesley, and now Lyle doesn't want him in the apartment. He doesn't want Malcolm to see what he'd done to Lesley. Something had to have happened. He had to have been hiding something inside that apartment. He'd never not let anyone in his apartment before, especially his own cousin, just to use the bathroom as well. Something was up. But Malcolm never got to find out what was inside the apartment. Lyle didn't let him in, and Malcolm eventually just ended up going home. He thought it was a really weird thing to happen at the time, but he kind of forgot about it until this point. So anyway, this was just a little bit more evidence for police to say that Lyle was sketchy and that something had happened in the apartment that night. And at this point in the case, police and the media were making it so obvious who they were looking into. The suspicion against Lyle Herring was felt among the whole public. Everyone was suspicious of this man. Like, police had stopped looking at other people. The public had stopped accusing other people. At this point, everyone was pretty certain that this guy had definitely done something to his wife. And Lesley's sister, Aasha, was still doing public appearances, and instead of just begging for her sister to come back, or if anyone had done something to her sister to come forward to the police, she now started also begging for Lyle Herring to cooperate with the police. In public TV appeals, she is begging the suspect in this case to just talk to the police. And it was as all of these TV appeals were happening, one of Lyle and Lesley's neighbours actually saw one of Aasha's appeals, and this triggered them to call the police. They saw something rather suspicious on the Saturday night before Lesley was reported missing. And at the time, it didn't seem too weird, but now in retrospect, it was very suspicious. So this neighbour was heading back to their own apartment around midnight on this particular night, and he actually passed Lyle in the hallway. He saw Lyle coming out of his apartment. And Lyle was carrying one of those dollies, you know, like a standing trolley. He was carrying a dolly with a roll of carpet on it. And he carried it all the way from his apartment all the way to the furthest elevator at the very end of the corridor. Like I said, at the time, this was a very normal thing to see, someone getting rid of one of their rugs. You know, people do throw things out all the time. But looking back, the neighbour realised that that roll of carpet or that rug was very widely rolled, like big enough to fit a human inside. And as soon as police heard this witness statement from this neighbour, they were convinced that Lyle Herring had murdered his wife, Lesley. This was the first actual piece of evidence that genuinely pointed towards murder as a possibility. I mean, everyone had been thinking it this whole time, don't get me wrong, but this was the first actual piece of evidence that screamed Lyle killed Lesley. All the other pieces of evidence so far had been suspicious, yes, and it was obvious that Lyle was trying to hide something or cover something up, like with the Starbucks receipt. But none of that actually screamed murder until this point, when it looked like Lyle was actually getting rid of a body. So police decided at this point that they needed to step up this investigation, and so they brought in a cadaver dog. If you don't know what a cadaver dog is, it's a sniffer dog. It like sniffs around and it can sniff out particular scents like dead bodies or blood. And Lyle had 2 cars, and they were specifically interested in these cars because how else would he have got this body out of his apartment building? So they sent this one particular cadaver dog named Indiana Bones, which I can't figure out if that name is distasteful. I think it is. I think I don't like it. But anyway, they sent this one particular dog into both of Lyle's cars. He had this big SUV and an old Cadillac, and this dog went sniffing around both of them, and it actually alerted to the smell of dead body in both of these vehicles. In both of them. This was huge. This was a huge, huge moment in this investigation, but police decided to keep this as silent as possible, as secret as possible. They didn't want anyone to know how much they were on to Lyle Herring, if that makes sense. Obviously, if that got back to Lyle and he realised just how much evidence they had against him at this point, he would do a runner. Again, I mean, he'd already tried to get over the Mexican border. There was nothing stopping him taking off once again. So they decided to keep this quiet because this was the most likely way that they would be able to find Lesley Herring's body, because if they told Lyle that they knew he had a dead body in his car, then he might go back to the site where he left the body and either move it or hide it. And so if police just kept quiet, then they'd be able to find it themselves. So instead, police actually decided to attach trackers to both of Lyle's cars, like GPS trackers, so that they could follow him anywhere and everywhere he went. Honestly, they were actually kind of hoping that he would go back to where he'd hidden Lesley's body, because then they could follow him there and then they'd have it. They watched him for almost 48 hours and Lyle did nothing weird. He didn't go anywhere suspicious. He was literally just like going to work, going back home, going to see family. He was doing nothing odd. That was until the 3rd day of the surveillance. On that day, he woke up at 6 a.m, which was unusual for Lyle. He never normally woke up that early. And then he got in his car and drove 3 miles to a local park. This was not a regular thing for Lyle. I can't stress this enough. He never woke up this early. He never went to this park. He never just went for walks, especially so early in the morning. This wasn't a regular thing for him. He wasn't known for going to this park, and so police were immediately like, oh, hang on, what's going on here? And this park was actually quite tucked away from the rest of LA. It was quite remote, and so again, police's senses were tingling, and so they watched him drive into this park. He parked up in the parking lot, and then he walked over to a bunch of huge dumpsters. Of course, police couldn't really get out of their car and go over to where he was, because then that'd just really give it away. So they had to stay in their car and kind of try and watch him from afar, and they watched him walking around these dumpsters. He's like looking around on the floor, kicking at things. He did this for a couple of minutes, and then he just goes and gets back in his car and drives away. I think he just went home after that, and police were sitting there thinking, we have definitely just seen something related to this murder. This was not normal. This was not a normal thing for him to do. He drove all the way out to a remote park to look at the bins and then get back in his car and leave. I mean, absolutely not. There is obviously more of a reason as to why he did that. Maybe this was the place that he dumped Lesley's body. Maybe he was going back there to check on it, or to have a look around to see if searches had begun there or something like that. What if he'd actually dumped Lesley's body in one of those bins, in one of those big dumpsters, or even just around them? And so police decided to once again bring in cadaver dog Indiana Bones, because they wanted to see if that was the case. This dog had clearly alerted to the smell of Lesley's dead body in Lyle's cars, and so if it could alert to it over here, then they were on the right tracks in finding Lesley's body. So they bring this dog in, and what do you know? It located to the smell of decomposing body just a few feet away from these dumpsters. This particular spot that the dog alerted to was like a mound of dirt. It seemed as though it had just kind of been like all piled up. So police are looking at this mound of dirt, and it looks unsettled. It looks as though something's kind of been dug up and then reset, but the dirt hadn't quite settled and been pressed into the ground yet. It was clear that it was kind of like freshly moved. So police are thinking, right, we are about to find Lesley Herring's dead body in a shallow grave here. They were certain of it, and so they brought in a digging team to get going and try and dig up her body. This team dug and dug and dug in this particular area, but nothing. They didn't get to anything. There was nothing under that particular mound of dirt. But the dog had still alerted to dead body, so how? What could that have been that the dog was picking up on if there was no body there? But police had a theory to explain this. They thought that maybe Lyle had taken Lesley's body out to that park. Her body was obviously in his car, so what if he opened the boot of his car, took her body out of there, and then left her on this mound of dirt while he opened the lid of the dumpster and then picked her body back up and put her inside the dumpster and then closed the lid and left. That would explain why they can't find her body, why that particular part of the ground has the scent of dead body on it, why his car has the scent of dead body in it. But this was also a very concerning theory for police to have, because they knew that if this was true, if their theory was true, that he had put Lesley's body inside the dumpster, then that meant that they were probably never gonna find Lesley's body. By now, her body would have been taken to a landfill site, and I've actually covered a couple of cases where dead bodies have been put in a dumpster and taken to a landfill site, and they never get found because it's such an expensive and dangerous operation to try to even locate them at that point. Searching a landfill site just isn't really an option. It would mean that that whole landfill site would have to be out of use for ages, which would throw the whole city into just complete chaos. But even if somehow they could search the landfill, they still probably wouldn't find it, because the amount of rubbish that gets put into landfill every single day, and it had been a while at this point, it had been a good few weeks, months even, since Lesley Herring went missing. There would be so much rubbish on top of her body in this landfill by now that they weren't going to find her. They just weren't. So that was quite a heartbreaking realization for the police to come to, and for them to explain to Lesley's family as well, that this is the strongest theory that they have, but that means that she'll never be able to be properly laid to rest. But on the positive side of this, police finally felt as though they had enough evidence to arrest Lyle Herring on suspicion of the murder of his wife, Lesley. Over a year after Lesley's disappearance, without even finding a body, police went down to Lyle Herring's office and arrested him then and there. But it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. Police actually didn't want to arrest this guy in front of all of his friends, in front of all of his colleagues. They didn't want to show him up like that. And so instead, they went inside and they made up some lie about his car. Maybe his car was towed, or like, I don't know. There was an issue with his car. But basically, this was just to get Lyle outside so then they could arrest him outside his office. I'm sure it wasn't to preserve his dignity. I'm sure there was more to it than that. At least I hope there was more to it than that. I hope they weren't doing this so they wouldn't embarrass this murderer. But either way, Lyle Herring was charged with her murder that exact same day, and the case was set to go to trial. And this trial was going to be a rather tricky one, of course, because they don't have the body, which is the biggest piece of evidence in a murder case. Of course it is. They're trying to prove that this guy killed Lesley when they can't even really prove that Lesley is dead at all. For all they knew, she could actually be out there somewhere. I mean, it was very unlikely based on all the evidence, of course, but she could. Thankfully, there was a decent amount of circumstantial evidence, but it was going to be really hard to fight this case. And because they lacked that huge piece of physical evidence, they lacked an autopsy, all of that kind of stuff, police had to theorize a version of events. And to this day, we don't fully know exactly what happened to Lesley. But this is the most believed theory to this day. So I'm about to tell you all of that, but remember, this is just a theory. It's based on like crime scene evidence. So police actually believe that Lesley Herring's cause of death was drowning. They believe that she was drowned by her husband, Lyle Herring, after an argument that night. When you think back to the evidence inside the home, especially in the bathroom, there was that big pile of crumpled up towels. Some of them were still wet at the bottom. It was as if they'd been soaking up a lot of water. It was as if the bath had been running for a long, long time. It had overflowed. It would also make sense as to why Lyle wouldn't let his own cousin, Malcolm, use the bathroom in his house the day after he would have murdered Lesley. And it's because it would have still been a mess. There would have been water everywhere. There would have been towels everywhere. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the argument was about that sparked this whole thing. To be fair, we don't even know that an argument took place, but that's just the most believed theory. This argument broke out and then maybe it turned physical, which police believe is what led to all those little things being out of place in the house, like the candle in the kitchen being knocked over and stuff like that. They think it got a little bit physical and then Lyle just flew off the handle, dragged Lesley to the bathroom, filled the bath, and then drowned her. And then once she was dead, he wrapped her up in this rug, put her body on this dolly, and then carried her out into the hallway, down the lift. He carried her all the way to the garage of the building and then put her body, they believe, first in the trunk of his SUV. Remember I said he had two cars and he kept them both in different garages. I think he kept his SUV right at the building and then his Cadillac in like a special garage. So he put the body first in his SUV, drove it to where he kept his Cadillac, and then transferred the body from his SUV to his Cadillac until he figured out what he was gonna do. Police think he was just doing this to buy himself some time because he traveled in his SUV everywhere. So if he needed to go to the shop or to work or, you know, anything, he didn't want the body in his car. So he left Lesley's body in the Cadillac overnight and he spent that whole night thinking about what he was going to do, how he was going to dispose of the body. And then in the morning, when he had all his plans sorted, drove his SUV back to where he kept the Cadillac, transferred the body again back into the SUV, and then drove out to the park where he put Lesley's body in the dumpster. The court heard this theorized version of events along with all the circumstantial evidence of like the Starbucks receipt, him trying to cover up the fact that Lesley was missing, all the fake phone calls he made between both the phones when they were literally just next to each other, and even like the proper evidence of the cadaver dog and his neighbor seeing him carrying the body out of the apartment. And with that, the jury decided to find Lyle Herring guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years. And that is actually all I have for this case. There's usually a little bit more to say at the end, but not much is really known about how Lyle is coping in prison. And of course, Lesley's body was never found. I think these cases are some of the most heartbreaking when the family never get that closure. They never get to know exactly what happened to their loved one. They never get to lay their loved one to rest. And the worst part is that Lyle knows exactly what happened. and he just won't say. He just won't tell anyone. He knows he's got that over Lesley's family, and he likes that he's got that over Lesley's family. He likes that he won't let them have peace. It wasn't enough for him to ruin one person's life. He had to ruin all her family's lives with it as well. But yeah, that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, they're giving you guys that limited time offer of 30% off of an annual subscription, making it just $3.50 a month plus a 2-week free trial, so don't miss out. Remember, go and click the link down below in the description to go and grab hold of that offer. Do it now. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. That would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a link to do so right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there'll be a link to do so right here. And if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be one on screen right now.